The snow this morning, I was reminded of a story that I think I've told you before, but I'll tell you again. There was a minister of a small country church and got there in the middle of a blizzard one winter day and shoveled the walk and lit the stove and was sitting there, and one farmer showed up. And he wondered what to do for a while and finally decided, well, just go ahead. So the two of them sang a hymn, and then the sermon, the pastor said to the farmer, he says, "Well, what do you think I should do?" And he says, "Well, did you prepare a sermon?" He goes, "Yeah." And he says, "Well, if I go out to feed the cows and only one shows up, I feed the cow." And he goes, "Okay." So he went ahead and delivered his sermon, gave all the points, gave an ending, and afterwards says, "Well, what do you think?" And he says, "Well, if I went out to feed my cow and one cow showed up, I'd feed the cow, but I wouldn't give him the whole load." So I'm thinking about whether I should give you the whole load. Yeah, I figure they can listen to it on the internet if they want, ones that aren't here. Well, I want to talk to you about faith this morning. And faith is it's obviously a topic we've talked about myriads of times over the last 24 years, but I want to just reflect on it again. And I think that it's very easy to think of faith sort of along the lines of used to be this saying, the power of positive thinking. That somehow, if I simply generate enough mental energy, then that's the equivalent of faith. That if I truly convince myself that I believe this, whether intellectually I do or not, then that's what faith is. When I was in high school, I knew a young lady who had a boyfriend, and she was in love with this young man, and he contracted leukemia. And she knew that faith was something that was a contributor, that people would become healed if you had faith, and so she determined that she was going to have faith. And she prayed constantly for this young man and was at his bedside throughout this whole journey and praying for him, and trusted and stood up and testified that God was going to heal him, and he died. And her faith never totally recovered from that. It was devastating to her. And there's verses like in James where it says, if you are sick, if there's any sick among you, call for the elders, and the prayer of faith will heal them. Now, as I read that, I'm not sure whether it is the prayer of the faith of the person who's sick, whether it's the faith of the elders. And so that's sort of an interesting thing to wrestle with there. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But another instance I thought of was when Wanda Radford was sick. And Wanda Radford had a huge impact on a lot of people in this church, and many of us felt like she was just really, really important. And as she was going through that process of cancer and being treated for cancer, I remember that they went away to a service of some kind. I don't know specifically what the point of the service was, but she came back, and in the midst of that service, she said somebody had stood and testified that God had told them that he was going to heal her. And her response was, "I believe that God is going to heal me. I think that I'm going to walk away from this cancer." And he didn't. She died. What does that mean about faith? Does that mean that there wasn't faith, or that there wasn't the right kind of faith, or that faith was delusioned? How does that all work? The other issue in this is doubt. And the question I'm asking, is doubt and faith always contrary to each other? Is it possible to be a person of faith and still be a person that entertains doubt? And the last thing that I want to just throw out there, how much responsibility do we have for our own personal faith? Is it something that we simply have to generate ourselves, or it is something that God generates for us? When I was in high school, I was pretty much in charge of a haying operation, and there were literally hundreds of acres of fields, and I mowed them. I would rake the hay up, and then I would bale it. And then after the hay was all baled, the owner and one other guy would come, and we'd load up all that hay onto wagons and ferry it back and load it into the barns. And I remember every spring, as we were first starting to pitch those bales on the trailer, going home, and my arms would just be in agony. I could just, oh man, I could hardly feed myself. And at the end of the summer, we had these arms look like Popeye, and I just, man, this is great. And they don't look like that anymore. But I think that's a good analogy to the process of building our faith. And I think that in reality, faith building is something which we are in cooperation with God. That there's a God part of it and that there's our part of it. And I want to look at a passage of Scripture this morning and talk a little bit about, from that passage, about how God uses instances in our life to build our faith, and then how we respond to them affects how effective that is as well. So Chris is going to come and read Matthew chapter 17 to us. Yeah, just that one.
All right. Well, Matthew chapter 17. After 6 days, Jesus took him with Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, a bright cloud enveloped them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, "Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." The disciples asked him, "Why then do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first?" Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands." Then the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. When they came to the crowd, a man approached Jesus and knelt before him. "Lord, have mercy on my son," he said. "He has seizures and is suffering greatly. He often falls into the fire or into the water. I brought him to your disciples, but they could not heal him." "O unbelieving and perverse generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy here to me." Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of the boy, and he was healed from that moment. Then the disciples came to Jesus in private and said, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" He replied, "Because you have so little faith. I tell you the truth, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you." When they came together in Galilee, he said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and on the 3rd day he will be raised to life." And the disciples were filled with grief. After Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax came to Peter and asked, "Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" "Yes, he does," he replied. When Peter came into the house, Jesus was the first to speak. "What do you think, Simon?" he asked. "From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own sons or from others?" "From others," Peter answered. "Then the sons are exempt," Jesus said to him. "But so that we may not offend them, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch. Open its mouth, and you will find a 4-drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours.
Thank you. First thing that happens in this chapter is what's referred to as the transfiguration. It says that he took the inner core, the 3 inner core, and he took them up on a mountain, probably somewhere in the vicinity of where they had just been, Caesarea Philippi, near Mount Hermon probably. And it says he was transfigured before him. Now, let me just say to you that no one knows what that means. We have no idea what happened or why that happened or what it is. But I have an opinion about what I think happened. And in the midst of what happened, 2 individuals appear as well. And the individuals are significant as well. The word transfigured actually means metamorphosis. It's the same root word as metamorphosis, like that a worm metamorphoses into a butterfly. It's that same root word. And I'm curious, how many of you watched the video, braved through it? It's mind-stretching, isn't it, a bit? Yeah, my wife watched it, and why in the world are you having them watch this? This is confusing. Well, I don't begin to say that I understand it as well, but the current position of people's understanding of heaven at the time of Christ was, and I've told you this before, that heaven exists somewhere above them, that the gods were up there, and that there was also some place up there where humanity ended up going. And what's fascinating to me is that God doesn't challenge that belief. In fact, even in Jacob's dream, almost seems to kind of reinforce it. So, I think that God allows them to be confused about some things, which is an interesting aspect of God, which we could discuss at another time. But anyway, their belief was that, they were up there and that someday we would go up there. And a lot of the language of the Scripture talks about that, where it talks about Christ coming in the air and returning in the clouds and going in the clouds. All that's connected to that misunderstanding as to where heaven is, because heaven's obviously... Remember when the Russian Soviet went up into space and he said, I don't see God anywhere up here. Must not be a God because I can't see him. Something like that. Well, the whole study of dimensions to me has been revealing in the sense as to where I believe heaven exists. And I believe that heaven exists right next to us in an alternate dimension. And I came to that conclusion for a lot of different reasons, but I think that what happens in the Transfiguration is that we are getting a glimpse of Christ on the edge, on the verge, on the cusp of transitioning from this life to the other life. And the reason I think that picture is because of the fact that there are others that you can see that are also being brought to that cusp. And there's that dividing line between this line and the next line where we step from here to there. And Christ is at that moment. There's one other time where that happens, and that's in the book, To the Person of Moses. Do you remember when Moses was on the hill and it said that God passed by him and he came down and his face was glowing for days? They had to cover him with a veil because he had experienced the cusp of transitioning from this life to the next. And his body actually was tingling with the effects of that. I don't put a lot of stock in books about people that have gone across and come back. It could be true, but I just don't know. But I think this is an illustration of a time when a human was right on that verge. And so one of the things I believe that helps us to have faith is to get those little glimpses of heaven on earth. To have those moments where people were brought back from the edge of death and have transitioned back and said, I was right on the edge of death and I'm not sure that I really wanted to come back. It's an amazing thing. And so the root of our faith is in that. So you have this amazing thing, and it's interesting why those 2 individuals, and no one knows for sure, but it's probably because I think that Moses had sort of been there, and neither of these two people's bodies were ever found. Elijah says went up in a UFO, and Moses went up on a mountain and just vanished. They looked for days to find his body, and his body wasn't there. And I think the reason his body wasn't there because he just stepped across that line, and his body was transformed into its eternal self. And the same thing actually happened to Elijah. So Moses was the founder of the law, sort of the establishment of the law, and Elijah was the symbol of the prophets. And the prophets and the law were the two things that the Jews valued the most important. That was where God taught to them. That's how God communicated his truth. And so to have these two individuals there is extremely important. And Christ wanted his inner circle. His desire was that their faith be built up. His whole process. In fact, as you look at the ministry of Christ, it's really not about the multitudes. It's really about the disciples. His point in those 3 years isn't to bring multitudes of people to himself. It's to mold and to shape and to build the faith of his disciples. And in the disciples, he recognized that there were 3 of them that were crucial to the faith development of themselves and to the others as well. And so that's why Peter and James and John were there. So the first thing that we would say is that it gives us a taste of heaven. And then they come down from the hill, and there's a really interesting story about an individual who needs to be healed, this young boy. And actually, if you really want to delve into this story, there's a lot more detailed account in the book of Mark. Mark actually was the first gospel that was written, we believe, and we believe that the other gospels were sort of based upon Mark. They probably maybe even had a copy of Mark with them when they wrote their own, or they at least had talked with Mark. And Mark, we believe, got his information from Peter. So Peter's information is firsthand. Peter was one of the ones that went up on the mountain. And Peter was one of the important ones in the early church. And Peter's the one that Jesus was talking to when he talked about the kings of the kingdom. And so in the book of Mark, there's some information which isn't in either Matthew or Luke, although all 3 of them record both these instances. But he comes back down, and there's this demon-possessed young boy. And there's some fascinating things that happened here in this. But one of the things I think that is typical of people is to sort of use healing as a threshold as to whether or not they're going to have faith. It's sort of the, can't think of the word. They present healing as to God and say, God, if you will heal this person, then I'll believe in you. If you heal my spouse, if you heal my son, if you heal my parent, if you heal my friend, then I will trust in you. I will believe in you. It's the thing that people hold and challenge God with. Most often, I think more than anything else. Which is curious because God heals so very few times. So rarely does God, in fact, heal, even among his faithful, among his own people. It's a rarity for God to rescue people from the edge of death. And, I think we're extremely privileged to have a couple people in our congregation that God has brought back from the brink, even though we've lost many, many people. But it is sort of the defining line for many, many people. And the Bible tells us that we're all going to die, that we're in the process of dying, that we are transitioning from this life to the next. And it's perhaps even more puzzling to people like these disciples who have had a taste of what heaven's like, to say, why would we use that as the very defining thing? Why would we use healing when healing is simply preventing us from eternity and from this incredible experience of existing in another dimension with God and experiencing life in a way that we had never experienced it before? Nevertheless, that's the truth of it. But in this, account, he's talking to this man, and he says to him, first of all, to his disciples, why couldn't we drive it out? And read this and the other passage, and Jesus says to them, well, let me back up and say that previous to this, he'd sent the 60 out, and they'd gone out, and they had had success with driving out demons and with healing and all kinds of things. And then this one comes, and they are not able to. And Jesus says that there's something about the faith process that is a growing thing. And there are certain things that you will not be able to accomplish at this stage of your growth until your faith is larger. And he uses the illustration of a seed. And I love that illustration because it gives hope. And I don't see this as Jesus condemning or criticizing his disciples. I see it as a teaching moment for them. And he wants to impress upon the importance of being diligent about growing your faith and about recognizing that faith is a muscle, and that as you experience God doing different things in your life, then your faith begins to grow. And you need to remember those things. And not everyone's faith experience is the same. That's one of the wonderful things about being in community, is because your experience of faith is different than my experience of faith. And I may not have the same experience of faith. There are some things in my life that I look back and I say, those are definitely illustrations of God involved in my life. And those were faith-building experiences. I'm convinced I saw an angel. There was a time when God miraculously spoke in a very, very clear voice and told me exactly what a problem was. Solved an issue for me. And it was a crisis for me. And so I look back on my life, and those were faith-building experiences. You have different faith-building experiences. So the fact that they couldn't drive out this demon was a faith-building experience. And what he said is that there are some instances in your life, you will come to some things in your life that you simply will not be ready for. But if you set out on the proper course, eventually even those things will be something that you'll be able to deal with as well. There may be issues in your life today that you simply cannot deal with. There may be particular disciplines that you're struggling with. There may be certain addictions you're dealing with, certain temptations. You don't have the faith to overcome them now. But you know what? God is planting seeds in your heart so that someday you will. That you will grow into this magnificent tree, and those won't be an issue for you anymore. And there are some things that we do that are the faith-building process. We talk about the Christian disciplines, and in several weeks is the beginning of the season of Lent. And I encourage people every year to use this as 8 weeks where can be a faith-building exercise. There can be something in your life that you simply give up, or something that you add to your life for those 8 weeks. And it's like working out, spiritually exercising to develop one specific part of your life. And for many people, those are the seeds of something which grew into something magnificent. You may have had to plant that seed several years, but to where at the end of the 8 weeks you continued and said, you know what, I'm just going to keep doing this. I'm going to make this a part of my regular life. But that's a seed-building time. The other thing I just want to say about this is there's a phrase in here that every time I read it, it was disturbing to me. It says, "You unbelieve." This father comes to me, he's distressed, and he says, "You unbelieving and perverse generation, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." And it sounds nasty to me. I mean, honestly, if someone came up and said that, I would just think, man, that just seems rude. That just seems rude. So here's my reaction to that statement. It's actually worded slightly different in Mark. I think rather than a statement of exasperation to the father, it was a statement of just being in heaven. I think that he had tasted eternity with his father and with humanity on the mountain. He comes down and he realizes, how How much longer do I have to be here now? When do I get to finish? When do I get to go back? And it's important for us every time we evaluate Christ to make a couple of prior suppositions. First is that God is always responding in love, that God defines love, and that even if God does something which doesn't seem loving to us, it is loving from him because he is the root and source of love. And that's not excusing God, I don't believe. I think that it's simply saying from our perspective, we don't understand everything that God is doing. And there's something else that happens that shows the tender and softness in the next story. So let's move to that. The next thing that happens is the temple tax. And Peter kind of gets himself in a tight bind. And he's wrestling with this whole thing of shame and wrestling with people's expectations. And so he makes, yeah, we're going to do that. We're going to pay that tax. And then Jesus takes him aside. And very tenderly. So here is the tender, the soft, the loving aspect of God where he takes Peter and he says, Peter, you know what? And he tells this little story about children and their father and their parents. And he said, you really think that we need to pay that? Nah, you're right. It just wasn't thinking. So then what happens? I was thinking about this. What does he have Peter do? He asks them to do something which is right in his realm of comfort, isn't it? He doesn't say, okay, I want you to go up on the hill, I want you to dig a hole, and you're going to find some gold up there. He doesn't say, okay, I want you to go down and make a pot and sell it, and it'll be worth a lot of money. He's a fisherman. The wonderful thing about God is he takes us where we are. He takes us what we're comfortable with. He takes us with the gifts that we have, the strengths that we have, and he builds on those. And Peter had already seen some incredible miracles in the fishing department with God, hadn't he? Remember the story of the nets? Throw it in your net, and he brought up all these fish. So already he's thinking, well, I know God can do wild things with fish. And he's confident when he walks down there, but still a little mysterious, still mystified and wondering, how is this going to work? And it works out the exact way that God anticipated. So there's this wonderful blending of trusting in other people's journey of faith, but also knowing that God has put us in a specific place with a specific journey, with a specific way that's going to grow our faith, and how important that is to share that with other people, isn't it? And to say, God is growing my faith in this way. And other people can say, wow, I don't even fish. That's so great. God can use fishing in your life as well. The muscle of faith. God wants to grow it in your life. It is something that you do with him. He's like your personal trainer in faith. And he's encouraging you and inviting you to participate and to grow this thing of faith. It's not just generating positive feelings. It's not just the power of mentally making yourself believe something that you don't really believe. It is building a tree from a tiny seed where God planted it in your heart and to where it will grow. And he invites you and me to join him on this great journey of growing into a person of faith. Stand with me and let me dismiss you with the benediction.